segregation in the Deep South was forbidden. The few people daring enough to fight against segregation were often arrested, beaten, or even killed. Those few willing to take that risk were known as the Freedom Riders, and I, Victoria Koch, have the privilege of sharing their story. Who were the Freedom Riders? Well, for starters, the Freedom Riders were people that were set on integrating the Deep South. Their mission was to travel from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans on interstate buses. They rode Trailways and Greyhound, and there were a total of 13 riders, 7 black and 6 white. They were to do this without being violent to anyone and began with high hopes and the idea that their goal would be easy. The beginning. The Freedom Riders were created to experiment with the Supreme Court's ruling in Boyton versus Virginia. Before the ride started, there was some training provided. However, that would not be enough to prepare them for what was to come. They departed Washington, D.C. May 4th, 1961, with no protection from the government or the presidency in regular interstate buses. The first few days went without much conflict. Some towns would, of course, integrate for the time the Freedom Riders were there and then go back to the usual segregation the next day. The first incident, Anniston, Alabama. On May 14th, 1961, disaster struck. The next stop was Anniston, Alabama, and inside that town was a mob waiting to beat, burn, and destroy anyone that dared change the traditional ways of the South. The first conflict happened at the bus stop, but the driver was able to go through. However, the tires were punctured. After a few miles, the mob caught up to the bus, and they broke the back window with a crowbar, then proceeded to throw a bomb onto the bus, causing a fuel tank explosion. This resulted in smoke and fire, which caused the Freedom Riders to be barely breathing once they got out, only then to be attacked by the mob waiting outside for them. This was an important emotional impact for the riders and changed what they had thought in the beginning. The second incident. The second bus of Freedom Riders arrived at Birmingham, Alabama. There was another mob waiting for them. The KKK and Bull Connor made an agreement. This agreement was, of course, unlawful and horrible. For 15 minutes, the KKK were allowed to beat, bruise, attack, or even kill the Freedom Riders without being arrested afterwards for whatever they had done. One man had a face so badly beaten it was covered in blood. The Freedom Riders felt victimized after this, of course. Even though they did, they continued to persist and they still wanted to continue the rides after that. However, no one was willing to drive, so they had to go back on a plane back to Alabama. As you can see, his face is badly beaten. Media. News spread across the globe of the horrendous violent acts towards the Freedom Riders. This was a story embarrassment for America. They had shown the world that the United States had inequality and racism. John F. Kennedy, the president at the time, had difficulties defending America's character. The spread of the news gave Freedom Riders attention they needed to grab the attention of the globe and integrate the South. The comeback. The Freedom Riders were not done yet. There was a new wave of riders coming on May 16, 1961. These riders were students from Fisk University, a historically black college. They were led by Diane Nash, a famous civil rights leader, and were aware of what would happen to them. They were prepared to die. Right before they left, they signed their last wills and testaments, and they had to do this, for violence would not win against nonviolence. The third incident, Birmingham, Alabama. Students tried to integrate with African American in whites only sections, only to be arrested afterwards, and then at night they were taken to the state line and told to go home. They did not do this at all. In fact, they marched right back to the bus station, even though it was a really long walk, just to have to wait even more because no driver was willing to drive for them. At the same time, there was a large mob of KKK growing around them, and a disaster was bound to happen. The third incident, Birmingham, Alabama, continued. The chief law official was willing to protect the Freedom Riders before any chaotic incidents would happen again. So, Alabama state troopers were sent over on a helicopter, and even a helicopter came over and protected the Freedom Riders until crossing the Montgomery lines. Even in Montgomery, there was a mob, so of course they were forced to call 400 United States Marshals, and that protected the Freedom Riders until the Mississippi line. The freedom out of the Freedom Riders. So, the Freedom Riders arrived at Mississippi bus station and tried to integrate, but were arrested and charged for breach of peace. They were sent in cars to the Mississippi State Penitentiary to be scared straight. Thousands heard of the arrest and chose to join the Freedom Riders instead. This unified the movement. In fact, if one Freedom Rider was arrested, another rider would replace them right on the spot. This led to the diverse group of skin tones, religions, and backgrounds, with over 400 joining and 300 arrested. The movement. At first, the movement was not at all supportive of the Freedom Riders. In fact, they thought it would do more harm than good. Eventually, the movement stood next to the Freedom Riders and supported them. The outcome. On September 22, 1961, change was finally achieved. The Interstate Commerce Commission ordered the removal of segregation from interstate transportation, and this was the succeeding of the goal of the Freedom Riders. Their plan had worked. Nonviolence had finally won against violence. Leaving it in history. These are my works cited, and these are the images cited. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I'm so sorry, maybe it's not working.